the Get Together session brought to you by getAbstract. I'm Kirsten Müller-Daubermann, and I'm your host for today's session. We're so glad that you've joined us today. We have a really great conversation today about how to focus, communicate, and work better, especially given the challenging times that we're all facing. And we have a great guest, Andrew Savikas, over on the other side of the screen, who I'll introduce in a moment. But as I wait to have people sign on and join this conversation, just want to let all of you know that we want to share the resources that we have at getAbstract with all of you so that you can navigate this crisis both in your personal and professional life in a way that is educated and knowledgeable, and you're not doing this alone. So we want to share those resources with you. The full getAbstract library, over 22,000 books, is available for free until May 18th. So please go online to getAbstract.com and take advantage of those resources, share them with your friends and colleagues. Also, you can sign up on getAbstract.com for our daily newsletter, which chooses stories and abstracts and puts them into the context of the current crisis so that you can be well informed. Also, want to let you know that this video will be available later to watch, obviously on our Facebook page, but also on our Vimeo page. So if you hear something today that perks your interest or that you really want to share with someone, of course, you can share that with them later. Those videos will live live here on our Facebook page as well as on Vimeo. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest. We have Andrew Savikas. He is Chief Strategy Officer at getAbstract. Welcome, Andrew, to the show.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thrilled to be here.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking today about the book Your Brain at Work by David Rock. And, you know, before we dive in, because I know this book has special importance for you, and you outline so many things that David talks about throughout the book in a way that's really helpful for people at work, specifically now. But before we do, why don't you give us an update? Where are you joining us from, and what does life in lockdown look like in your corner of the world?
Sure. Thanks for asking. I'm joining you on a sunny Wednesday spring morning in Boston, where the flowers are just starting to bloom on the trees I can see from my window, but the streets are a little quieter than a usual spring morning here. We're holding up pretty well. I'm here with the family, my wife and kids, so you may hear them in the background a bit along the way. I hope that's okay. But we're trying to do our best. You know, the city is holding up pretty well. I think we're feeling fortunate that things haven't have held pretty stable, so we're doing okay.
Awesome. It's so great. And it's so wonderful to connect with you too, because what's neat is getAbstract obviously was founded in Switzerland, but there are team members all over the world. Obviously, you're sitting there in Boston. I'm here in Switzerland. And so it really is the definition of working remotely and learning how to collaborate and work together well, even though we're across the ocean from one another. So I just think that's pretty cool. Very glad to hear that you are doing well. Let's talk about the book, because you've talked about this book before. You've done other webinars on it and written articles. What originally drew you to the book, and why have you revisited it? Why is it so relevant now?
Sure, that's a great question. So a few years ago, I had the chance to work for about a year with a fantastic coach. His name was Jonathan Rosenfeld, and his perspective was very much informed by neuroscience and cognitive science. And I learned so much in working with him. And part of what I learned was understanding how our state of mind and how our brain affect our performance and our communication. And so things like how important it was to label how we're feeling, and how just the act of identifying what we're thinking and how we're feeling can actually help us be less affected by our emotions and sort of plugs more into the logical parts of our brain. And you know, the work I did with him kind of led me down a path of trying to learn more about you know, what cognitive science could teach me about how the brain works and how my own my own brain affects my work. And I have always read a lot of business books, and that's one reason why getAbstract is such a great place to work. But I read pretty much every book I could find, and this was one of the best that I found, in part because it's just filled with a ton of practical tools that you can use right away and that are easy to remember and easy to apply. And I often find myself using the frameworks and the tools and the ideas and the concepts that David talks about in his book, and he's got another one called Quiet Leadership, which is great too. But the fundamental concept that really stuck with me from this book, and that I use all the time, is just reminding that the brain has sort of metaphorically has kind of two two parts. There's David calls it the elephant and the rider. This notion that there is the bulk of our brain is the part that was developed over billions of years. It involves the amygdala and the sort of animal lizard brain that we have, and then there's the more recent modern most human thing, which is the prefrontal cortex, and that's the logical, rational, reasoning part of our brain. And if we're not careful, then it's just as an elephant and a rider, that older part of our brain is very powerful and very strong. It can go very fast in directions that we don't necessarily want it to go. And recognizing who's in charge sometimes is a really important part of figuring out how to move forward the way you want to. So that sort of key concept is what stuck with me. And then building on top of that, just a ton of great advice and tools for improving communication, improving understanding, improving your own just awareness of how your mind affects your work and your relationships with people around you.
Yeah, and I really encourage people to go and read the abstract, and of course read the book, because it is very complex and he dives into the neuroscience. And for those of you out there who, like me, are really interested in how the brain works and all these complicated details, it really offers that. One thing in particular that David Rock talks about is he outlines a system called the SCARF model. And you have identified this as something that's been really helpful in your own work life. So why don't you lay out, SCARF is an acronym, SCARF. Why don't you lay out what SCARF stands for and how it's been helpful for you?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And business books are filled with frameworks and models and acronyms, and most of them just sort of pass in one ear and out the other, I think, when most people are reading and hearing these things. But for me, just the first time I read this, it really just stuck in my brain and has been there ever since. So there's 5 parts of this. There are 5 kind of dimensions along which we respond to different stimulus. And the 5 are status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And I'll talk a bit about each of them in a second. But the idea is for each of these, we tend to, based on what we hear or what we experience, we either have a reaction that we want more, we kind of lean in because it feels good and someone's helping us feel like, we're important. Or it's the opposite. We have a reaction that makes us want to go away. It's kind of like lean back and we don't want any more of what's happening. So you can sort of think of each of these 5 dimensions, and something could be something positive or negative. So status, that just means, do we feel valued? Do we feel important? Do we feel, like we matter, right? And if people say things and do things that help us feel that way, then we want more of it and it feels good. Conversely, if someone sort of diminishes our status or leaves us feeling not important, then that can not feel so great. And we sort of kind of close off from that. The same thing with certainty. So, how sure are we about what's going to happen next? How certain are we about the future? And the more certain we are about what's going to happen, we're okay. It's more comfortable. Lots of uncertainty doesn't feel so great. Autonomy, that's, really, do we have control over those circumstances? Do we have the ability to influence what's going to happen next? Relatedness, do we feel good and close to the people around us? And then fairness is fairness. So do we feel like we and those around us are behaving fairly and things are happening in a way that's consistent with our values and expectations. And the idea is, again, along each of these dimensions, we can be pushed one way or the other, and that can have a profound impact on how we respond to a particular situation or how we feel after a conversation or encounter.
I love that. Thank you for laying those out. So status,
Sure.
Certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. Okay,
That's right.
I love also that it's called the SCARF model, particularly now when we're all focused on covering our faces. So it's a really good, great tool. That. Think about, like, wrap your scarf around, protect yourself and others by using this great model of communication. So when you look at those, and as you've done your own exercises in self-awareness, which one of those is triggered most for you? Because I would imagine as people are listening to you, they're probably thinking, oh yeah, that one really triggers me. Which one is it for you?
Yeah. Oh, sure. That's a great question. And that's a good point, because it kind of works both ways. So you can think about, how are the things I'm saying and doing affecting others on these dimensions, but also, of course, how am I responding to events around me? And just that awareness of, it turns out, I've observed from myself personally, I'm super sensitive to the autonomy dimension and sort of feeling like I have sort of control over what I'm doing and what's going to happen next. I'm okay with uncertainty in terms of not knowing what's going to happen, but I want to have some control over what that's going to be. And I've noticed, the times I get most frustrated or most kind of down on what's happening is very often it's tied to a feeling of just not feeling I have the autonomy to influence what's going to happen next. And for everyone, it might be a little different. I know some people, might respond. I've worked with people who time and again, the thing they bring up is, well, this doesn't sound fair, right? It can really vary based on different people. But for me personally, it's a lot of it's autonomy, and that's definitely influenced how I approach things. And it's also, building on the work I did with that coach a few years ago. There was a technique that he shared that is very consistent with this model, which was about being thoughtful about, the difference between intention and attachment. So you might really want an outcome, and you can intend for it to happen, and you can do all that you are able to make that happen. But at the end of the day, no one has full control. And if you get too attached to that outcome, then it triggers that feeling of, it ends up feeling like you've lost something, feeling like this is this fatal blow of this thing that you got so attached to happening didn't happen. And that can really trigger some, not great responses and reactions. And so, for me, again, it's been about learning how important feelings of autonomy are and how much I use that to influence conversations about what thinking about what I want my work to look like and what kind of things I want to do and how I want to do them. And I would certainly encourage people to spend some time thinking about, along those dimensions, what are the ones that matter most to you, because that can help you identify, well, that's me responding perhaps a little bit too much to feeling like my autonomy is threatened, or that's me feeling like things aren't fair, and just again, labeling, identifying can go a long way toward treating it more mindfully.
And that kind of ties back to the elephant and the rider concept that you talked about, whereas at least just being able to become aware of what's triggering us and labeling it brings the thought from the amygdala, or that unconscious reaction part of the brain, forward to the prefrontal cortex, where we can then use rational thought, apply it, and decide how we're going to respond, rather than just respond from our lizard brain, right?
That's exactly right. And it applies in a lot of different places. So my wife encountered a similar concept in a book she was reading, a parenting book. And it's this notion with kids of the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain. So the same thing, same concept. Downstairs brain is your sort of lizard kind of, that kind of brain, and the upstairs brain is the more thoughtful, logical one. And when kids get worked up and they're really emotional and they're crying, their tantrums, that you can't reason with someone in that child in that state. You can't, because their downstairs brain is but it turns out what you can do is you can do small things like get them to answer questions, get them to speak. Just get them to respond. Would you like me to help you right now? Just that little switch can get them engage that upstairs brain and help bring a little bit more control over what's happening. And the same thing happens to all of us. And so that there's definitely been a lot of ways that understanding that distinction has helped sort of me be more effective, I hope, in my work, and also I hope helped a little bit in better understanding and relating to even people around me, like my kids.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I bet that the parents out there who are watching this right now, maybe their kid is over there, and they're like, I'm so relating to you right now, Andrew. Thank you for the parenting wisdom. Do you have any other examples of where your knowledge of this SCARF model has helped maybe with others in conversation, or with clients, or other businesses that you're working with?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's one that stands out to me. I remember it was soon after I think it was soon after I read the book, and I was about to meet with a CEO of a company that we were looking to do business with. It was at a prior job, and it was important to me that the conversation go well. And we were in an environment. I think we were at a conference where there was a lot of people, a lot of distraction, a lot of conversations happening, and I didn't want to just be lost in the noise. And I was sitting down, and I pulled out an index card, and I wrote down the SCARF, and I thought of like one or two things I could say that would that were tailored toward reinforcing these things. So for example, saying something like, you really must be proud of the business that you've built. It's really hard to do, and you should be proud of all you've accomplished. Something like that. It's not manipulative. It's just being honest. But it's just things that you can quickly think about that you can choose to, you don't have to, but you can choose to incorporate into the conversation so that you have them at hand. And a couple things I noticed about that exercise, and I've since repeated it. One is it gave me a bunch of useful things to drop into the conversation, and I could sort of see, in real time, I could sort of see the person's face respond, just very like, wow, sort of think, it's very, you could sort of see the reaction in a very, they were very sort of disarmed and made them more comfortable and open in the conversation, which was very helpful. But the other thing I noticed was that just sitting down and thinking of a couple basically really nice things to say to someone put me in a really positive frame of mind. And I think that combination of me feeling positive about this person and having lots of sort of good things to say that were going to be received well, and of course the reception of that really helped the conversation go very well, and it really helped. I'm convinced that conversation went much better than it would have otherwise. And again, I've since sort of replicated that exercise on occasion to good effect.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. We have been soliciting questions from Facebook and our viewers. And of course, I invite anyone out there who has maybe a way that something like this has worked for them in their organization to please share that, or just say hello in the comments. But we do have a great question from Michael. So the abstract says, leaders try to get others to change by giving them feedback, but no matter what technique you use, feedback often threatens people's status. That's the S in SCAR. So they reflexively defend themselves. Suggesting solutions to someone else's problems wastes everyone's time. Instead, if you can help people quiet their brains, they'll be more likely to generate their own insights. Michael says, great, but in really stressful, disruptive situations, you don't have that time and possibility, do you? Is there an example in your own story or maybe an anecdote of how you were still able to manage or nudge colleagues in the their direction?
Yeah.
Great question, Michael.
Sure. That's a great question. So yeah, I have a great example. So that's right. So another thing to think about this is if you're giving someone feedback or giving them information that is pushing them kind of down in one of these dimensions, then they are likely to sort of pull back, and they're not going to hear the rest of what you have to say in the most productive way. But it's true, sometimes the reality is the reality, and there's nothing you can do to change the fact that someone's status is legitimately being changed, or that something is happening that's legitimately out of their control. But there are a few things that can be done to address it. So one is that these things are all kind of related, and in some ways you can counteract one by pushing up another. And so one thing to do in that situation, there was a time I remember a few years ago at a prior organization, we were making a pretty significant internal change that was going to be really disruptive to it was for our sales organization at the time. We were going to be rolling out a entirely new kind of product and technology stack that was very different from what they were familiar with, and it was generating a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity within the organization. And I remember having a meeting with the team, sort of the leadership team. We were talking about this, and there was a lot of questions and resistance and concerns. And a lot of it, I think, stemmed from a feeling of a lack of control over what was happening. In particular, there was one of the executives who worked for me at the time who was going to be really key to getting this on board. If we couldn't get him on board, the effort was never going to succeed. And the reality was we were going to do this no matter what. And so it was, how do we get this person to come along and feel like they're a part of this? And so what I said is, okay, what would have to be true for you to support this 100% of us making this change in the next 90 days, right? So the reality was we're going to make this change in the next 90 days regardless. But I gave him a chance to exert a degree of autonomy by setting his sort of terms of what would have to be true for him to go along with and participate and support this. And it shifted the conversation very quickly from a defensive, no, we can't do this, to okay, well, here's what I think would need to happen. And it actually turned into a very productive dialogue, engaged the rest of the team, and we really helped move past a lot of the resistance and negativity and into a much more productive sort of building and constructive frame of mind.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. And I love that this really does
Mhm.
work in real life. And that's a brilliant example. Thank you for sharing that. We are nearing the end. So if we've got any other questions or comments, now is the time to jump in there. So I've I see that we are expecting a question. So I am going to wait on that one. So Andrew, it seems like this pandemic
Yeah,
threatens each one of these criteria all at the same time. It
yeah,
affects our status. It affects our level of certainty. Goodness knows it does
yep,
that. It affects our autonomy, our ability to maybe
yep,
work or go where we need to go. It affects our ability to relate with people. And it
yep.
affects this feeling of fairness. This doesn't feel fair. How can this pandemic just come out of nowhere and send the global economy reeling and kill millions, or
Hmm.
afflict millions of people around the globe,
Yeah.
and then inflict job insecurity and unemployment on millions more. How do we start addressing some of these criteria and from a personal perspective when all around us we see all of these difficulties threatening these criterion of emotional stability?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I wish I had a truly definitive answer for how to address that on a global level, but it's absolutely right, and that gets back to the point I made earlier about how a lot of times we either intentionally or unintentionally compensate with. Well, if we're feeling one is low, and then we sort of compensate by pushing another up, and so it's not entirely surprising at all to me that um, we're doing a lot of things to reinforce that relatedness thing in non-traditional ways. So the sort of proliferation of Zoom dates and Zoom cocktail hours and just trying to relate to each other. I know that people are diving into Facebook and Twitter more and getting things that we're sort of desperately trying to recapture and reinforce this sense of relatedness, because that's one of the only ones that we have realistically a whole bunch of influence over in the near term. At the same time, I think there are
Mm.
things, if you sort of stepping back and identifying it and saying, well, one of the reasons I feel so lousy right now and so stressed right now, so anxious right now, is because I don't have any certainty of what's going to happen next. I don't have autonomy. And are there things you can identify that you can exert some degree of autonomy over? And you sort of see that in some of the advice out there about, like, well, one of the things to do is establish a routine and establish a set of things. And I think we've seen this. I've seen this in my own house too. I see the sort of evolution of new kind of family rituals and traditions happening now, because it's a great way to exert a degree of control over what's happening, and to say, well, no matter what's happening in the world right now, every Sunday afternoon we're going to do this family board game thing or whatever it is. There's a lot of things that you can do to help elevate some of those things. And I would say one simple thing that this framework can be useful for is that same exercise I talked about earlier, where sit down and write some things. You can do that for yourself or for those in your family and those around you. Things that might help. Is there something you can say to your coworkers or your spouse or your kids that will give them a sense of status or a sense of certainty about that you're going to have a movie night tomorrow? Something that gives them a degree of certainty what's going to happen next can make a big difference. And just doing that a little bit at a time can make a big difference. So that would be my advice for trying to use this to some extent a little bit to help in a very, very uncertain time.
Those are great pointers, actually. Thank you for that. I'm actually going to use some of that, even though I don't have children. But the scheduling thing and finding little ways throughout your life, even if there is so much that's out of your control, finding little things to say, I'm going to plan this, I'm going to keep doing this routine, I'm going to schedule this. Great advice, Andrew. We do have another question from Facebook, actually.
Uh-huh.
Imploring you to give them parenting advice. Okay, so this is from Gretchen. She says, love your parenting advice regarding tantrums and logic and asking them questions to help calm them. This pandemic has caused a lot of change and disruption for children with homeschooling, lack of social interaction. What advice do you have to help kids to understand this pandemic?
Wow, that's a great question, and it's something I'm struggling with. My wife is struggling with. It's a challenging thing for kids who don't really understand why their world has suddenly been turned upside down. But again, I would go back to, can you? It's going to be really hard to try to tackle the very challenging task of explaining a global pandemic to a child. but understanding that they're influenced just as much by these things, these different categories: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness, as adults are. And again, thinking, what are some things I can do to top them up, each of those tanks, whatever the case may be. And that by itself can help make everyone a little bit more calm and a little bit less anxious and a little more willing to and able to engage that logical part of your brain, so that you can sit down and say, well, today we're going to learn about, earlier this morning I went downstairs and my wife was playing a game with our kids where they were using little cotton pom-poms of different colors to represent, these were the viruses and these were the antibodies and these were the particles, sort of a fun way to illustrate and learn and build on things that are happening, and just, rather than trying to, again, tackle the big thing, but, building little bits and bricks and pieces, supported by reinforcing their status, the certainty of what they can expect, the autonomy that they have to whatever degree you can give it to them over their environment, finding ways they can relate to their friends via video chat or FaceTime or whatever it is, and trying to, when possible, it's always challenging with children, but trying to be as fair as possible with what you're doing.
Yeah. Oh, such great advice, Andrew. I bet you didn't. You maybe didn't expect that you would be doing a live session and be giving so much parenting advice.
Well, it's, part of what we have to do in a time like this is kind of be kind and be, parent ourselves. And that's part of what this is all about. And it's such an important thing to do.
So great. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your takeaways from this really, really great book. We very much appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And I just want to encourage all of you to check out David Rock's Your Brain at Work. Obviously, read the whole abstract. There's so much goodness in there, as well as the SCARF model. And of course, read the whole book. But that's why we're doing these get-togethers, to put these great resources in your hands. So I want to encourage you to check out that link, read that abstract, and again, sign up for our daily newsletter so you get all of the latest news about the pandemic in context in a way that's applicable for your everyday life. And there you can also sign up for updates on the rest of our get-togethers. We'll be doing these pretty much every day. We like to interview authors and members from the team at getAbstract to let you know what we're reading and what we would recommend to be most helpful for you. So wherever you are in the world, wishing you a wonderful rest of your day and rest of your week. And we'll see you back here tomorrow. All right. Bye, everyone.
Extraordinary challenges require extraordinary responses from thought leaders, company executives, and employees. As the coronavirus pandemic unfolds and businesses scramble to adapt to escalating containment efforts, getAbstract is here to help organizations navigate this crisis wisely and professionally. For over 20 years, we've been committed to providing relevant knowledge from reliable sources to help people make better decisions in their personal and professional lives. In line with our mission to empower decision makers with relevant knowledge from trusted sources, we are proud to offer businesses free access to our full library until May 18. Embark on a no-strings-attached knowledge journey with getAbstract.